Good jobs, quality jobs.
We still have so much to do for women's rights.
For the parents to go to work, you need good childcare.
We will not have a successful recovery.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Eurofound Talks. Today I'm utterly delighted because today we are going to talk working conditions. And not any normal working conditions, but the European Working Conditions Survey. This is Eurofound's flagship survey. It's been operational for the last 35 years, and we really do bring to the table a unique data set which looks at working conditions and how they've changed over these last 3 to nearly 4 decades. But before we get started in that, it's also to provide a context. Because while today we will talk about the survey and the information it brings, we are doing that within a context of a greatly changed labour market, much the same way as mechanisation changed agriculture and manufacturing in the 20th century. We have digitalisation and the development of AI, which has really bulldozed forward over the last 5 years or so and promises to be the plough of the professional classes now and into the next phase of our working lives. Job tasks, profiles and broader working conditions are in flux, and sometimes as a result of this digitalisation, but not only. We have issues relating to job quality, which are changing. We have gender equality at the workplace. We have labour shortages, which we're finding in particular areas, and that can be due to issues in terms of working conditions. But I suppose the current rate of change that we're seeing at the moment is important not only because of these elements and many more, but also because it really is unprecedented. This world of work has been consistently evolving and adapting for decades, but now really we are seeing changes that even in the last 20 odd years, where my guest and myself have been working in this organisation, we have seen more in the last 5 years probably than ever before. Many of the jobs that are dominating the labour market today were unheard of, for example, just 3 decades ago. And the diseases that we saw then, which would have been mining diseases, black lung disease, silicosis, etc., these are largely gone. The kind of health and safety issues that we looked at 30 odd years ago probably don't exist to the same degree. But we are looking at new stressors and new risks at the workplace, such as technostress, burnout, musculoskeletal disorders, etc., etc. It's a long and big and wide subject for us to tackle today, but no better person to do that with than Barbara Gerstenberger, who you will have heard before on Eurofound Talks, where she has talked about many issues with regard to job quality and working conditions. And she's the head of unit for working life here in Eurofound. You're very welcome, Barbara.
Good morning, Mary. Nice to be here.
And indeed to have you back with us again. So Barbara, today we're kind of giving a sneak preview, if you like, titillating our masses to talk about the Working Conditions Survey, because of course the most recent Working Conditions Survey has just been carried out and we're now finessing the results with a view to presenting them to the public in the autumn. But let's look back a little bit, Barbara. And the Working Conditions Survey, which is Eurofound's unique European, pan-European survey, was launched in 1990. That's now 35 years ago. Can you turn back the clock a little bit for us and paint a picture of what working life looked like at that stage? What were the kind of industries we were talking about? What were the main drivers of job quality? What did it look like in terms of a working conditions vista back then?
Well, it was certainly a very different picture, Mary. Back in 1990, we surveyed a very different workforce in an EU that had 12 member states, Western European member states only. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. It was a male-dominated workforce, much more male-dominated than it is today. The employment rate for women was around 55%. Today we are at 70, so big difference again. It was a much younger workforce because the younger cohorts were bigger and people started to stop working earlier. So today, almost 50% of 60 to 64-year-olds are still in employment. At the time, it was less than 20%. So it was a much younger workforce. Those who did work were for most of them were working full-time, so the share of part-time workers was much lower. They were usually on open-ended contracts. The share of fixed-term contracts was lower. And then, of course, you hinted at it, the economic structure was quite different. We had a lot more people working in manufacturing jobs, which disappeared not necessarily because manufacturing lost importance, but because of productivity gains and fewer people needed to produce what we are still producing in these manufacturing industries. As a result, over the time, we then saw a shift to service jobs, business services, social services. That was not that apparent at the time yet. And of course, the reduction in agricultural jobs that had continued long before 1990. We saw a little bit of an increase in the share then again when the new member states joined in 2004, but that was the economic structure that really led to different working conditions and different challenges at the time. And then of course also how we worked was very different. Already at the time we asked about technology use, the use of computers. And in 1990, around a third of workers said that they were using computers regularly. And then when we asked the question again in 2005, of course, the share of workers using computers regularly had increased over time. But there were still more than 40% of workers in the 2005 survey that said they never use computers at work. So unthinkable today. Now, that I think also tells you something about the speed of adoption of technology,
Absolutely.
at least at the time. I would guess the latest technological developments, use of AI at the workplace, I would bet on a faster adoption there.
Interesting, isn't it? It's interesting how much things have changed, really, and particularly over the last very short period of time. I mean, as you say, then we were talking about fewer people because we were fewer number of member states. They were younger. They were more male, but interestingly, they were also more standard employment. So what we now would see is that 9 to 5, the whole Dolly Parton song, working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. I mean, this manufacturing approach as well, it was very, I suppose, standardized. It was men who went to work. It was indicative of the times that they were. Yes. So now we're looking at a working conditions survey, which is surveying a very different population, a wider population, a population with different goals, etc. But the working conditions survey back then, what was it established to set out to achieve? Yeah,
this commitment to improve working conditions. That goes back to the very beginning of the European integration project. It's mentioned in the very first treaty, in the Treaty of Rome, that established the European Economic Community at the time in 1957. That's where it's already said one of the objectives is to improve working conditions. So if you want to improve something, you need to know where you are. You need to assess and quantify working conditions. And that's exactly what what the working conditions survey set out to do. And then to analyze the relationship between different dimensions of job quality, different types of working conditions. So how is working time related to work intensity, related to the development of skills, etc. So these relationships, that was also something that the working conditions survey set out to establish and to describe. And then we were talking about the composition of the workforce and the question, do all groups of workers benefit from an improvement in working conditions? Or do we have groups that are of particular concern because of the sectors they work in, because of the gender, their level of education, etc.? So these differences between groups and really identifying where it is most needed to intervene, that's another objective of the survey. And then, of course, you establish a baseline, but then you want to monitor trends, and that's one of the reasons why we keep repeating this survey.
Asking the same question.
Exactly,
to a large degree.
exactly.
Yeah.
And with doing all this, you then have the possibility to provide policymakers who need to decide, well, how are we going to go about this commitment to devise policies for better working conditions, to advise policymakers, this is where you may want to look, and these are the linkages, these are the associations, and that should really help to formulate better policies that lead then to the improvement of working conditions. So those were the objectives of at the time, and quite frankly, they have not changed.
No, those underlying core objectives haven't changed, I suppose, but the context evolves, doesn't it?
Totally.
So over the last 30 odd years, we've seen different targets, different objectives emerging at European level to integrate more women into the workplace, for example, to ensure that we have a sustainable workforce that goes beyond what we would have considered the retirement age previously, that they work longer and better, that the health and safety arrangements within new industries, which have moved beyond manufacturing, respond to the needs of the day. So I suppose there's new objectives that we need to see whether what we find with the working conditions map onto those objectives and map onto it well in a way that's going to facilitate them. But when you've looked at that, have you seen that the trends that you're seeing in working conditions across Europe during this time, what have they shown you for the most part?
Yeah, we have a tendency to look at and write about and talk about negative developments. But when you look at working conditions and job quality in the EU, it actually is, for the most part, a good news story. I think that needs to be made very, very clear. So take the example of working time quality, which has continuously improved, mainly because fewer of us work long hours per day, work long working weeks. Another element of working time quality is flexibility of the possibility to change start and finishing time. So moving away from a situation where it's the employer solely who determines when work is being performed. That has also changed quite dramatically.
Excuse me, Barbara, for cutting into you here, but that's also in response a little bit to that sort of growing desire to see greater work-life balance, isn't it?
Of course, of course. Again, if we think about a focus in 1990 would have been on the male industrial worker working full-time, being the sole provider for a family. So that was the picture that we had in mind. And then that changed dramatically. If you bring in women into the labor market, people with older people with some kind of disability maybe, not in full health, but still able to work, your concept of who do we need to create those working conditions for changes quite a bit.
So in fact, as society changes and expectations change within society, working conditions have to adapt to respond to that.
Have to pick up on
this. And that's what we're monitoring, and that's the trends that you're seeing emerge.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in terms of the big changes, Barbara, because in 2004, we knew that there was the enlargement to new member states, the 10 member states that joined in 2004, and they were largely from Central and Eastern Europe. And that must have shown us a great emergence of disparity in terms of working conditions. I can only assume that the gap was quite large at that stage. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair to say so. So again, let's start with the structural differences. A higher proportion of workers, I hinted at that already, in those accession countries still worked in agriculture. In some countries it was up to 20%, and at the time in the existing EU it was around 5%. So that already is a big difference. And that also then leads to a situation where, or led to the situation where the share of self-employed was much higher, because many people who worked in agriculture were, small farmers, and they were self-employed. We also had a much higher share in those accession countries at the time of people holding a second job. So 10% of people in those countries had a second job, also much higher share than in the existing EU at the time. They were working longer hours, so 44 hours on average. That was much higher than the average in the EU. Work was usually less decentralized. It was quite hierarchical. So in terms of autonomy, there were differences between workers. The average worker, we should always say. Training opportunities compared to the EU were lower. But again, let's not only focus on the negative differences. A very positive difference was that women accounted for a much higher proportion of the workforce in those accession countries. Take the Baltic countries as an example. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. The workforce was exactly divided: 50% men, 50% women. We did not achieve that in the existing EU member states. And it also meant that more women were in managerial and supervisory positions, which then meant that the wage gap, the gender pay gap, was smaller at the time in the accession countries.
Incoming member
yes,
states.
In the incoming member states, exactly.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And has there been since then a convergence, an upward convergence, I assume, of the working conditions between what we used to call the new member states and the older ones?
Yes, quite clearly. There has been a catching up of the countries that joined in 2004. And for the most part, there are different ways to measure this, and it's not an entirely precise and clear answer there. But for the most part, it has been a story of upward convergence, so catching up and everybody moving on to a higher level, a better level of working conditions.
And of course, that would also speak to the policy decisions that were made on working time. For example, you talk about them having longer working hours, but we have legislation in place which is rolled out at national level to address that.
Exactly.
And to say that, no, for your health and safety, we want to have a limited number of hours with breaks in between. And that needs to be applied across the member states, and that has led to an improvement of those working conditions.
Absolutely. These accession countries that joined in 2004 signed up to the whole legal framework, and we had seen a lot of legislation in the field of working time, health and safety at work, etc., that really were, I think it's fair to say, were a big contributor to improving working conditions in the EU, and that then led to a gradual but continuous improvement of those conditions in the new member states as well.
Which I suppose is one of the gratifying things about the Working Conditions Survey, is that we're able to show that results from that and data from the survey is able to help. It contributes to that policy making process, which says we see the results in the data and we need to address that. And in some cases, we need to initiate or form policy which can improve those working conditions in those particular countries, sectors, industries, whatever it may be. Okay. In terms of other things which have had a significant impact, I mean, clearly we've had the Great Recession, which hit us, and we thought nothing else would be as demanding, but then it was swiftly followed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that had huge impacts on working life, in the sense that we didn't work at all in the same way any longer, because most of us, unless you were at the front line, moved home. And many of us had never done that before. And the idea of swapping your workplace for your home place to carry out your day's work was, I suppose, novel for many. But the implications of that in the longer term for working conditions, have we been able to see that in the results from the survey?
Yes, as you describe it, I mean, this was really, during the pandemic, a big experiment, you know, working from home, orders, lockdown, and suddenly we realized that a lot of the tasks, the jobs that we used to do in the employer's premises only could actually be done, if not perfectly, then at least quite well from home. So this is something that was not forgotten once the working from home orders were lifted. So we still have a much higher share of workers working from home. No, most of them no longer full time, but for some time regular in hybrid work arrangements, or occasional a couple of times a month, who have the opportunity to do that. So it has leveled off at around 20% of workers who do that. If you ask for preferences, the share of people who say, oh, I would like to do that if that was offered to me, is much higher. So there is a potential to go above those 20%. And of course, the question is, why do workers like this? And it's quite clear, it's the saving of commuting time. It's therefore the better work-life balance that you can achieve. People very often feel they're more productive when they're working from home because they have more autonomy to organize themselves, etc. So these are the positive aspects of remote work. On the other hand, we see in the survey as well their downsides. It comes with some problems as well. One of them being working very often longer hours, and also working during times that were originally or would traditionally be seen as free time. And that then leads to a situation where, you know, these boundaries between this is work and work is over and now it's family time, these boundaries are getting murky, and that is not good for your mental stage. It leads to a situation that you have work-life conflicts, in the sense you can't stop worrying about work, even though you're no longer working. You can't really focus on the family because it's still in the back of your mind. So these kinds of work-life conflicts we see much more frequently among those who are working remotely, and especially among those who have these hybrid work arrangements. Interestingly, it's better for those who work from home full time. So, you know, there are issues around working remotely that need to be addressed, that we need to think about. But overall, it's quite clear, I think, that telework, remote work opportunities, that is here to stay.
It would be here to stay, certainly in the way that we work into the future. That seems to be a given. However, I assume that will also imply certain changes in the working conditions survey into the future also, because there will be questions that would never have been asked of workers who were previously in the workplace all of the time, whereas sometimes now, if they're working from home, they're working from a bedroom, or they're working from their sitting room on a chair that isn't particularly ergonomically friendly. These are questions which you could never have imagined integrating into the survey, which will in the future have to be considered.
Absolutely. It's a good example of something that we now need to explore, and therefore where we need to add new questions to the survey. And we have a few other examples where things change, working conditions change, adapt, and that means that the working conditions survey has to change to some degree, because of course we try to keep at least 3/4 of the questions unchanged, because that's the prerequisite to be able to say something about trends. But at the same time, we need to capture those new developments.
And Barbara, one of the interesting things that over the last few years here in Eurofound that we have been involved in is developing and elaborating on this job quality framework. And that involves, you can outline them, a series of dimensions that you look at specifically. And that allows then research colleagues to look very clearly at what constitutes a good quality job, which of course is one of the fundamental aspects of looking at jobs. We can create jobs, but are they good jobs? And I think that's a question into the future that we need to ask ourselves perhaps even more as we see the emergence of different types of the platform economy, etc. However, when the EWCS comes into play here, it really is very critical in terms of seeing what changes have happened in these different dimensions. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what has happened there in terms of improvements and deterioration.
Yeah, let me highlight some of them. What usually comes to mind first when people think about dimensions of job quality is the physical environment. You know, what are the physical circumstances in which under which I have to work? And there we see quite dramatic changes. For example, the exposure to, I would call them almost classical physical risks like noise, vibration, smoke, fumes. So associated with manufacturing jobs, this has gone down dramatically. Mind you, still there, but doesn't play as big a role any longer as it used to. On the other hand, we have a few stubborn physical conditions, like, for example, repetitive hand and arm movements, not good for you, still very, very prominent. 60% of respondents in the new survey said that they were exposed to this, they experienced this. Working in tiring and in painful positions, the second biggest chunk of physical issues that we are encountering, with 40% of respondents saying that.
And that would be across a range of sectors,
absolutely,
I presume, from the care sector, medical, health, right through to services, and then manufacturing still. Yeah.
But here's another one, and Mary, that will ring a bell with you and me. A new issue that is emerging is sitting, prolonged sitting. We now know is really is really bad for your health and well-being. And all our indicators are looking at this link. What are the conditions that we experience at work that are either impacting on our health and well-being positively or negatively? And sitting clearly has a very negative impact on your health. And more than a third of us sit for prolonged period in our jobs. And that, by the way, is another example of a new question. We did not ask about that in previous waves, but it's now so apparent how important this is that it was included in the latest survey.
The results of which we will see for the first time then when we deliver them in September.
Exactly. And rest assured, this will be highlighted, this the issue around sitting. On the very positive side, I think we should also say that the index that is measuring skills and discretion has improved steadily. And even in the latest wave, we see another improvement in that index. And that is mainly due to more training being provided, so very, very important, and because of increasing levels of autonomy at work. And I think this issue, giving discretion to workers, thereby encouraging their innovative thinking, providing training to workers, that's a core element of making Europe competitive. So that is so important and so positive to see that we really have a positive development in that index for skills
Barbara,
and discretion.
is it possible to give a sneak preview of the results on autonomy and discretion in the current survey? The reason I'm asking is because with the increased hybrid working and teleworking situation, the assumption would be that necessarily you have to ensure that a worker has more autonomy because they are not in the workplace, and I suppose that close management style which echoed the past is just no longer at play any longer. So are we showing results here? Do workers feel that they do have greater discretion and autonomy in their work?
The thing about the indices for measuring these 7 dimensions, one thing, and the first thing is you look at averages. And as I said, there is a positive development there. But the devil is in the detail. Once you start breaking down and look at specific groups, either specific sectors or specific occupations, or you look at the differences between men and women, or you look at different telework arrangements, or you look at the ways technology is used by the worker or not, and then look at autonomy. Then you see potentially very different results, and not always and necessarily for all groups positive. I just recall that, for example, one thing that we have already started to look at, does the use of artificial intelligence tools impact on autonomy? And we were kind of expecting to see a negative impact there. And that is actually not the case. It's still preliminary results. We may want to go deeper here. But in principle, we did not see any differences as regards level of autonomy, whether or not artificial intelligence was used, and also whether or not the workers were exposed to algorithmic management, which is another set of questions that we have included for the first time in the survey. So again, we need to look at differences between groups, and that's where you identify. The need or the areas where action might be required.
And to look back again, just very briefly on the COVID-19 pandemic period, clearly the working conditions and the impact of that on workers at the front line was, I suppose, much more critical than it was for those who were able to retreat to their homes. They had different issues, and we should not forget that 2/3 of jobs that we have in the European Union are not teleworkable, and it's only 1/3 of usually fairly high quality jobs, which are the teleworkable ones. So the working conditions survey also captures the needs of these different sectors, which were what we considered service workers, frontline workers during that period of time. And it's something that we shouldn't forget as we move forward into the next phase.
On the contrary, I think this is, for me, kind of the second change or the second lesson learned from the pandemic. One is there are a lot of teleworkable jobs, and there should be an opportunity to do them remotely if that suits the worker. But the other clear signal was that those workers who kept our society going during this difficult period, they experienced for the most part, rather poor conditions with very high work intensity, still feeling that despite the important work that they were doing, they were not getting the recognition they deserved for their work. Long working hours, weekend work, night work, etc. So really difficult conditions, and recognition through appropriate pay or other forms not really experienced. And I think it's no surprise that many of those sectors in which we had, in which those so-called frontline workers worked, are experiencing quite serious labor shortages because they are simply not attractive. The feeling of doing useful work is important, but
it's not enough if it's not compensated with other elements.
Have to be attractive.
And maybe, Barbara,
as well.
could you just talk to me a little bit about that? Because I just wanted to dovetail into, we've talked about the COVID-19 pandemic. We talked about the impact of the enlargement. But I think, one of the things that we're looking at now is labour shortages. We have practically full employment across the European Union. Things are good from an economic perspective, relatively speaking. However, when we're looking at labour shortages, an awful lot of the labour shortages are in sectors where the job quality is questionable. And this survey allows us to pinpoint that to a large degree. And is this a useful tool for policymakers to use in terms of addressing this issue of labour shortages?
I think it's going to be hugely useful to show in which sectors and also subsectors we can go relatively granular. certainly at the European level, because we have such a huge a sample. We interviewed 36,000 workers, so that's a good sample size. So we can get quite granular when it comes to examining conditions in specific sectors and subsectors. So that is going to be very useful. We have another very interesting, and it is actually a new question in the survey, where we ask workers which aspect of working conditions are most important to them. It was at the very end of the questionnaire. So we had interviewed them for 45 minutes, and kind of the cherry on the cake, the last question. So what does really count for you when it comes to work? And little spoiler alert here, very interesting findings, very significant differences in terms of the replies, for example, between men and women, which is something that should be kept in mind as well. And I think
pay was more important for men than it was for women.
What a good guess! What a good guess, especially for young men. And a safe and trustful work environment was most important for women, especially for young women. So I think that is also going to give us some interesting pointers. What are people looking after? And in combination with being able to pinpoint, and here we really find very poor conditions, below average conditions. In this combination, I think there is hugely relevant information on how can these labor shortages be addressed by making workplaces, sectors, occupations more attractive.
But I think that's also what's so fascinating and important about the job quality framework, is that I know that other work that was done in the agency recently looked at how, if you tweaked some elements of a job quality, whether you could actually persuade a doctor, for example, in Romania to stay in Romania, and that it wouldn't be by just tweaking one thing like pay. It could be that it needed to be pay and autonomy, or it needed to be intensity of work related to another aspect. And I think that's what's really fascinating about dealing with the different sectors, subsectors, country level, comparatively speaking, but then also being able to pull that out and look at it across the European Union and see what story does that actually tell us? What do we need to do in these different areas?
I think that's the beauty of the multidimensionality of this framework. You have different screws you can turn. You have several levers that you can pull. And if you can't afford to pay your workers better, well, working time flexibility could make a big difference.
Could be the defining element actually for those workers. Yeah.
Offering the possibility to work remotely at least a few days a week could make a difference. So giving workers more autonomy. We have this example of shift work. There are sectors and occupations where shift work is part of the deal. You cannot change this. But we have examples where the teams working in shifts have some autonomy to swap between shifts without involvement of management. You have the autonomy to make that work. Makes a huge difference to the acceptability of shift work. So, lots of possibilities to tweak and change, and not necessarily very expensive options.
No, and as you say, Barbara, I mean, that multidimensionality is just so it's critical in terms of understanding the big picture, because it's not a one-size-fits-all, clearly. And there's not one silver bullet that can raise living conditions and address the various policy implications. And here in the survey, you're also able to bring it to age cohorts, gender, are you able to do it by a type of occupation, type of contract that people are on.
Educational level.
Yeah. So you're in a position to be able to give data that breaks it down to a level of granularity, which really, policymakers will, I presume, be welcoming this with open arms. Talking about the Working Conditions Survey, the 2024 one, perhaps you can just give us an indication. I mean, we talked about the enlargement to 20 as it was then, 28 member states. Now we're at 27, of course. But it also is open to other countries. And we've extended the working conditions survey. There's a couple of other countries involved in that too. So perhaps you can just give us an indication of the scope of this last survey, who it covered. But also then really just I know you know, but what can you tell us of what you think might emerge from the findings?
Yes, regards coverage, 35 countries were covered, so the EU27 obviously, and then as in previous waves, Norway and Switzerland were very interested to join the survey and paid for their contributions, and then we had 6 Western Balkan countries also participating in the survey, and that is, gives again, interesting possibilities for comparing, because all of them are candidate countries to join the EU sometime in the future. Now, as regards results, I'll pick a few cherries. Don't want to give away too much. So I was already saying further improvements in working time quality, and we were especially delighted to see improvements in this working time flexibility, with more people having the possibility to adapt start and end time of working days to some degree, and the share of workers who have no influence on the structure of their working time is decreasing. However, what I thought was quite interesting, despite this improvement, excuse me, in overall working time quality, if you look at working time preferences, you still see that we have a surprisingly large share of workers who say that if it wasn't an issue from a financial point of view, they would like to work a few hours, shorter working time. And it's very normal to see that for those who work very long hours, more than 40 hours, even more than 48 hours. But even for the ones who have a very normal working week, 35 to 40 hours, 30% of them say, if I could, if there were no financial constraints, I would like to reduce my working time. So I think that's also a very interesting pointer for policymakers in this working time debate. One thing that we're going to investigate more, and it's part of the physical environment, is exposure to heat of workers. So we have a question that asks, are you exposed to conditions to heat that make you sweat, that even if we're not moving, if we're not working? And we can see that the share of workers who are exposed to heat is increasing quite dramatically since 1990, and we can go back a long time, as we have established at the beginning. And that especially those who are not exposed to high temperatures all the time, because those would probably be the ones who work in bakeries or foundries. But we see an increase in those who say we're exposed to these very warm conditions a quarter to 3/4 of the time. So that is an indication. Those are probably the construction workers, the agricultural workers, the transport workers who are outside a lot. Mm-hmm. And again, we see this share increasing even sharper in the Central, Eastern and Southern European countries. So these are the climate change, I think,
workers who are perhaps, picking strawberries at the moment in a heat wave.
Yes. Exactly.
So it's a direct result of climate change.
Yes, that is our hypothesis, at least. And then what continues to be an issue is gender segregation in the labor market and gender differences in job quality. And again, little spoiler here, when we look at the new results for use of artificial intelligence, so a new question, and you would probably expect you would see differences in use between different age groups. Younger people are usually more open to experiment and try these things. And that is something that we do see. But at the same time, for all age groups, we see quite substantial differences between use of AI by men and by women. Women are less likely to use artificial intelligence tools like ChatGPT, etc., than men. And that, for us, at least initially, was a bit of a surprise. So of a surprise. And maybe my last highlight there. We also, when we asked about technology use, we also asked whether the use of technology has taken away tasks. So, in the back of our minds, this fear that technology use will lead to job loss because tasks are no longer done by humans. They are done by artificial intelligence or other technologies, or whether the use of technology has actually added tasks. And it's quite interesting to see that whereas 30% of workers say tasks were taken away, more than 40% of workers say because of technology use, tasks were added. So I think that's another sign that we should not be looking at whole jobs that are going to disappear. We need to look at the tasks that make up a job. Some of them will obviously disappear, but others will be added. So I think there's an interesting dynamic, and these findings point to a need to look again in more detail at what is happening.
Fascinating, Barbara. So very clear reflection of the times we live in with the impact of AI and digitalisation on working conditions, also climate change. And clearly we didn't even touch on green jobs per se, but a lot of the working conditions issues that we're talking about also apply to them. And then, of course, the age-old working time quality issue, and the perennial gender dimension of everything that we do, not least in working conditions. So there's so much to talk about, Barbara, and I know that we don't want to provide every single detail here in this podcast this morning, but if we were talking to the policymakers and the social partners who will really be dissecting this and using, we hope, this data to shape better policies for future working conditions, it will be a particular milestone. I think it's probably fair to say that it has never come at a more important time, the working conditions survey and the results, in terms of responding to the needs of a post-pandemic working life, a digitally in transition working life, a climatic, if that's the right word, working life, but also where we are still looking at the pillar of social rights and reviewing what can we do in terms of reaching all of those targets we have for people living with disabilities, for women, for older people in the workplace, etc. There are so many elements that we need to respond to in this day and age. So if you can, talk to me in three main points that you would put on the table as being your highlights.
I'll try. My first point would be trends. The European Commission is discussing a quality jobs roadmap with the social partners and the member states. And if you want to promote job quality in the EU, which is the objective, which is the aim of the roadmap, you have to have a baseline. You have to know where we are now, where do we stand, where are the pain points, what evolutions have we seen over the years, and exactly that trend analysis you get from the EWCS 2024. Second point, gender equality. We have not been able to close the gender employment gap, the gender pay gap, the gender gap in job quality. We've started public consultation on the next EU gender equality strategy in May. So the EWCS gives the breakdown for all those dimensions, for the different issues that are high on the policy agenda, and is able to say what are the differences between men and women. So consult the EWCS for this. And last point, number 3, technology use. Again, policymakers are discussing the regulation of telework. Is there a need for a right to disconnect? Does AI at the workplace need to be regulated? And if yes, how? The EWCS 2024 will provide evidence on how technology is used and what impact that does have on working conditions and job quality.
Barbara, As always, a pleasure, succinct to the very end. Looking at this, I think policymakers, social partners, and indeed decision makers across all walks of life will be diving into the data as it is made available. The Quality Jobs Roadmap is a very significant milestone, and this really does allow policymakers to have a benchmark as to where we stand today, and equally the equality strategy on gender equality, a fundamental cornerstone of seeing occupational segregation, how that has moved on, how women occupy their work where they are, whether they manage other women, whether they manage men and women, where they're placed in terms of sectors, etc. And of course, you mentioned all the other gaps that we haven't closed. There's the pension gap as well, which I mean is not something necessarily we're directly involved in, but you can see that as part of our working life. And of course, the fundamental overarching question of digitalisation and the use of technology and how that's playing out in the world of work. So Barbara, there are three very important points. There will be many others. Feel free, please, to dive into the data, which will be available on our Data Explorer tool as of September this year. We will have a first findings output, which will be made available online and that you will be able to access to see the top level findings and how they have been analysed by our colleagues here in-house. The overview report, which will really give you a deep dive into an analysis and review of all the items and many more that we have discussed today for the 2024 EWCS data, will be available very early in 2026. So we are giving you, I suppose, an early bird introduction in September, followed by the overview report. So please look forward to that. If in the meantime you are interested in any item that you have heard us discuss today, Barbara is our colleague here and is an expert who's available to discuss aspects of this with you, as are many of our in-house experts on working conditions in Eurofound. Of course, that does not prevent you from accessing the current data, which will allow you to see the data as it has been and the trends since 1990, which is available at the moment on our Data Explorer, and you can find that on our data and surveys topics on our website. If you want to listen back to any of the other aspects we've also discussed, for example, sustainable work, older workers, gender equality at the workplace, job quality, these have all been discussed on Eurofound Talks previously, and you can access that on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, or indeed via our own website. In the meantime, for any other information, as you know, Eurofound is celebrating its 50th year. It is a milestone. It is very fitting that we are coming out with one of our flagship surveys during this year of celebration. If you want to follow that and other aspects, you can follow us online, or you can sign up to our newsletter or any of our social media channels. So until next time, thanks for listening, and until next time when Eurofound talks to you.